Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Polis Project Digital Book Salon. My name is Michael Busch, and I am the Director of Public Programs at Polis. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Banu Subramaniam, Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and the author of the book that we're going to be discussing today, Holy Science, the Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, recently published by the University of Washington Press. Before we begin, as always, I just wanted to briefly remind our audience that we're going to the extent possible, simulate an actual book event, which means that, again, to the extent possible, we're going to try to make it an interactive event with our audience, you. So if you have any questions that you would like us to ask of Dr. Subramaniam, please feel free to tweet them at us to our Twitter account at project_polis, or if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please just type your question into the comment section, and time permitting, we will ask the questions. But without further ado, Dr. Subramaniam, welcome to the Polis Project Digital Book Salon.
Do call me Banu.
Okay, Banu. Let's just jump right in and talk about the book and begin by setting the stage a little bit. You know, in the book, you examine the complex and evolving relationship between science and religion in India and treat that relationship as a site where India's engagements with modernity take place. You know, part of the story here, and the one that you focus on, has to do with Indian nationalism. Which you argue is a thoroughly scientific nationalism. Can you start by just talking about what you mean by this and where we see evidence of it in contemporary Indian politics?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored. So in part, the book, so I'm trained as a plant evolutionary biologist. So in some ways, this seems far afield for me. But the book really evolved as someone who, so I came for graduate school to the United States and I traveled back and forth to India, is really watching the transformation in India over the last 2-3 decades with the rise of Hindu nationalism. And in the United States, I feel we have seen a rise of a white theocratic movement. And as an evolutionary biologist, you know, of watching the ways in which evolution and the study of evolution is, you know, is constantly questioned, questions of, you know, God in the public space. So the boundaries between religion and science, you know, were squarely being challenged. Those, you know, the sort of the idea of the secular America and firm boundaries between, you know, religion and science, you know, were being challenged. And going to India was watching something very different happening with respect to the rise of Hindu nationalism. And in part, it's because Hindu nationalists don't see an opposition between science and religion. And in fact, they claim that Western science is has its roots in Vedic sciences. So they see a link between the ancient and the modern. And I just wanted to start with quote I use early in the book when Prime Minister Narendra Modi just became Prime Minister in 2014, and he was inaugurating a hospital, and he said this: "We can feel proud of what our country has achieved in medical science at one point of time. We all read about Karna in the Mahabharata, but if we think a little more, we realize that the Mahabharata says Karna was not born from his mother's womb. This means that genetic science was present at that time. That is why Karna could be born outside his mother's womb. We worship Lord Ganesha. There must have been some plastic surgeon at that time who got an elephant's head on the body of a human being and began the practice of plastic surgery." And this, to me, really encapsulates the heart of the argument. And maybe he was being facetious, as some people have said, but the idea that this is a god, right? He could have just said, gods have powers, you know, gods can have elephant heads in human bodies, or, you know, the blood doesn't need to circulate in such you know, godly bodies. But that's not what he did. He invented a plastic surgeon. He invented genetic technology, even in this mythological world. So sort of making claims that, you know, that these mythological stories where a lot of magical things happen really happen through science and technology. So if chariots fly, it's because, you know, they knew about airplanes back then. And indeed, not just Prime Minister Modi, but a lot of politicians, and in the lore of India are claims that sort of the 10 avatar story is a story about evolution. They had already, we already knew about, Darwin's theory of natural selection way back, surrogacy, genomics, atomic energy, planes, automobiles. So every modern day scientific or technological invention is seen as coming from mythology, as already having been discovered and invented in Vedic science. And so that's a very different imagination. And so as a result, what Hindu nationalists do is modernity, globalization, science and technology, neoliberalism, any of these sort of modern things fit seamlessly, within the larger rhetoric of Hindu nationalists. And so I found that imagination very different from what I was seeing there. And so I began to track it. And so what I do in the book is present 5 case studies of where science and religion are coming together. They are not antithetical. They just seem to fit seamlessly into the social fabric, into the scientific fabric of India. So when India launches the Mars orbiter, the head scientists go to a temple to pray for the good success of the project. This is not seen as, anachronistic or sacrilegious within the Indian tradition as it might be here. So that's sort of the crux of the book, is how science and Hinduism come together within the Hindu nationalist imagination and the Indian imagination.
Right. And the theoretical architecture that you sort of construct in order to examine these different case studies really draws on a number of people, probably most famously Foucault and his notion of biopolitics, which you argue or that you use, I think, to animate your examination of bionationalism in the Indian context. Can you talk about why this is a useful approach to thinking about modern India, and as well as the challenges that one confronts when thinking about biopower in a non-Western post-colonial context?
So, in a way, people would say Foucault is everywhere. If we talk about the West, we should be talking about Foucault too, because part of what Foucault chronicles is that in the 18th century, there was a shift from an idea of sovereign power, right? So, of sovereign power that had power over the populace and could impose ideas and policies of various kinds, to what he calls biopower. And so biopower is not top down. It is diffuse, it's embodied, it's everywhere. So it was a very different imagination of how power functioned, and how biology and the body became central to politics, to state power. And that's sort of what Foucault is chronicling. And part of what I'm doing in this book is I feel biology is also central to the Hindu imagination in very different ways than in the West. And in part because if you look, so for example, when we talk about the Vedic sciences, so there are clear ideas of the body and biology, sort of pre-colonial times. And then you have British rule, which transforms the biological apparatus in the ways in which biology gets confronted, right from the environment to health to disease. And then we have a post-colonial state, which again, doesn't do everything on its own, because you have global institutions that are shaping, how the state functions. So part of what I'm laying out in the book is a much more complex biopolitical apparatus, looking at pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial, that come together in slightly different formations that we might see in the West. And also thinking about Hindu nationalism itself, when if you think about the RSS, which is not the BJP is the party in power, but they have these weekly shakas. And so the whole idea of being a good Hindu, the training is very much about body discipline, about regimentation, almost militaristic training of some kind. And if you may recall that now we have World Yoga Day, of ideas of breathing and the body and taking care of the body. And so that relationship of the body and mind are very, very central to Hinduism and the mode of Hinduism that Hindu nationalists engage with. So that to have a pure mind, you need a pure body, a clean body, a well-structured body. I think ideas of body and blood are also very key to this imagination of, this is in our blood. Also claims that in terms of Indian Muslims and Indian Christians who might have converted, are they Hindu? We have the same blood coursing in our veins, and you see, different kinds of arguments happening there. And at the heart of the story, sort of throughout within looking at the history of science, is that what one sees is that there are long enduring debates. So, for example, the question of race, or the question of caste, or the question of gender, and claims of difference, right? Claims that this group is superior to this group. And what one sees in the history of science is that these debates never get sorted out. Once we have a new scientific or technological innovation, the debates come back around. So are there sex differences? Is it the hormones? Is it in the brain? Now, is it in the genes, right? And similarly, debates about caste get reframed within contemporary genomics. And so that is, again, very apparent in modern day India, of how those political questions get embodied in the body and then get re-litigated or re-debated in the public sphere.
Right. Before we get further into this, I want to just shift our attention briefly to the body of the book and the way in which it sort of takes shape. I was really struck by the way in which you organized Holy Science. And on the one hand, it's obviously and very clearly a work of academic scholarship, but on the other hand, the way you have organized the book reads very much to me almost like a piece of drama. It's got you've got acts that you sort of use to organize the arguments that you're making. You've got intermissions and the appearance of these avatars that you populate throughout the course of the book. And so I was wondering if you could just talk about how you approach structuring Holy Science. And the importance that avatars specifically play for you in exploring the biopolitics of Hindu nationalism.
Thank you so much for noticing. I think this is an aspect of the book that some people don't either doesn't capture them, but I think for me it's a deep the idea of genre is a very, very important question to me whenever I write. Because I think genres are not just about the style of writing. They're also epistemological questions of how we know the world. They're also questions of method. So if I were to write a scientific paper, there are certain structures that are, it's a pre-structured paper. I would start, with an introduction, the materials and methods, the results, I would discuss it, and then there was a conclusion. There are a lot of things that I might have found during an experiment, or things that might have happened during the experiment, but they have no place in the final scientific paper. And so I think each discipline has its own genre of writing. And part of what that genre of writing is so I take the idea of disciplines very seriously, in that I really do think our minds are disciplined. So when you're trained as a sociologist, you're trained as a sociologist. You're taught to observe certain things. As a biologist, you're taught to observe certain things. And I think part of what genres do is force you into that mold of training. So I've tried very hard in my writing to try and write in other ways, to open up that mind, to observe things I might not have observed, to write about things I might not have written about, outside of my training. And to me, writing about India, I really wanted to capture what it means growing up in India. And part of it is that storytelling is just all around you. And so growing up, mostly as a child, you were told stories about the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which are the two great epics. And there are stories within stories. So they would tell you, a story tonight, someone else would tell you the same story the next night, but there are new details, there are new characters, or they'll move off into telling you the story of a different characters. So I sort of felt that richness, both of the storytelling tradition and the richness of the mythologies. So there aren't the usual binaries of human, non-human, of gods and humans, about good and evil, of the sacred and the profane. Gods do evil things. Humans, the sort of so-called demon gods can get power because they have been so good. So it's I feel it's a very rich tapestry of what is possible. So I wanted to capture some of that in the storytelling mode, but also I wanted to tell a story about evolution. And so part of what I do is take the idea of the avatar stories from Indian mythology, and then tell a story about planet Earth. So with each chapter, there's an avatar story that goes with a chapter. And so, for example, a chapter might be talking about notions of purity, and insularity and nationalism and borders in the actual story. So, for example, around environmentalism. But then the avatar story would be telling a story of how the success on planet Earth is about impurity, is about hybridity. So I'm really trying to challenge those stories with a different kind of imagination, using this repertoire of the mythological stories of India that I grew up with.
Yeah. So let's talk about the case studies from there. You present 5 of them throughout the course of the book, and each one really traces, I think, a different aspect of the way in which binationalism functions in India. And the first one that you tell unfolds in the shadow of Modi's rise and the ascendant power of the BJP more broadly. You argue that women have been both central to this project and to this rise, and sidelined by it at the exact same moment. Can you talk about that further? How so?
So the BJP came to power in several modes. It's since 2014 they've been the majority party in power, but they also came into power in coalitions early on. So I wrote this book before the latest elections, and so I knew, as you know, book production takes a long time. So and so in tracking the especially the prelude to elections, right? So all the processions, the talks, the infrastructure of politics, women, have played a big role, and often, especially around Hindu-Muslim conflict. And what is interesting, and this is not something that I'm claiming, but people have written about in the literature, that a lot of the key figures tend to be either single or widowed. And part of the rhetoric, especially the part that women have played, is really in goading Hindu men to protect Hindu women by attacking Muslim men, right? So especially around the Gujarat riots, this was, sort of very, very prevalent. And in each of these modes, we see very key, female figures, female leaders, but often they are not given high priority once the government is actually formed. And one of the interesting things about Hinduism is that there are goddesses. So it's not a, sort of patriarchal, God structure, even though, yes, I would say it is a patriarchal religion and a patriarchal society, without a doubt. But you do have powerful female goddesses who can be violent, who can be militaristic, who can take revenge. But they are always taking revenge to protect a particular kind of order. And so to me, I find it very interesting to make this distinction between strong women and feminists. So India has a lot of strong women. A lot of our goddesses are extraordinarily strong. But what they are trying to protect, what they are trying to produce, is a patriarchal order. And so I think it's a very interesting and important distinction for me to make between sort of strength and creating a feminist context where women are actually empowered. They actually have power over their lives. And if you look at how things are playing out, so for example, the campaigns of love jihad that are going on now are all about protecting, about Hindu girls because they don't know better. They are being lured. They are being co-opted. So again and again, it is questioning the agency of women, the power of women as someone that needs to be protected. The whole idea of Mother India, Bharat Mata, which gets invoked again and again is the, where at least within feminism, there's this constant refrain of how men will open doors for you, but they will not pay you the same amount of, equal pay or any kind of political equity, but that there are all these slogans of opening doors, of chivalry, things that I would argue mean less than actually having power. And so there's a lot of symbolism of femininity, about women's power because of strong goddesses, and even on the election floor. But if you look at the policies that are evolving, it is assuming women are passive, women are victims, women need to be protected. And there's a great deal of control of women's sexuality, of how they should act, what are women's roles in the home. And so part of this idea of the archaic modernity that I'm trying to develop is saying yes, there are claims to being modern. So one of the wonderful slogans I've seen is be modern, not Western, right? So there's a claim of an Indian modernity that is not a Western modernity. But that Indian modernity, if you look at the cultural, gender, and caste politics, is a very conservative politics about what the role of women are, what their roles are in their home, as wives, as daughters. And so that's the contradiction that I'm trying to get at. And so one of the cases in that chapter you're talking about is I look at this ancient Indian architectural science called Vastu Shastra. And about it's for those who might not know it, its equivalent here would be something like Feng Shui, which is really about that there are energy flows in a house. And so where your front door faces, where different rooms face, where you put your, which direction you sleep, all of those things matter for your health, for passing your exams, for getting a promotion in your job. And so we've seen an explosion of these, sort of private sector architectural companies selling such things, as well as politicians of where they give speeches, how the stage is structured. And again, it's structured around this ancient Vedic science, ancient Vedic wisdom that will help us live today. But we see how commerce, sort of capitalism and these sciences come firmly together to promote it as a modern science.
Right. And, tied up in all of this, you argue, is a resurgence of Hindu masculinity. Can you talk about how science and the notion of woman power that you referenced earlier have been braided together and sort of repackaged as a triumph of masculinity?
So to me, the easiest example to talk about that is during a previous BJP moment when they tested, one of the missiles in Pokhran. And during that time, the idea of a virile masculinity is really at the center of Hindu nationalism. So as you know, it was a member of the RSS that assassinated Mahatma Gandhi, and that many people feel that a more militaristic response against the BJP would have been a better response than what was seen as a more effeminate, non-violent mode of Gandhi. So these are long-standing tensions in India. So part of what the claims when these in Pokhran was the BJP showing its virile masculinity. But when a temple was constructed at the end of it, it was called Shakti Peeth. So Shakti is the female goddess. So constantly we see, ideas of of masculinity and femininity playing together in each other with the backdrop of violence. And, we are at the moment in India and indeed in the US in terms of what happened yesterday, where we are becoming quite violent societies, where minorities are afraid and rightfully afraid. People have been shot in, broad daylight. People have been shot because it is assumed, they ate beef, whether they did or not. There is mob violence and mob justice. Because that is seen as the mode of recovering this injured past. So in both India and the US, the remarkable thing is that it is the majority of the country that feels it is the minority. So Hindus are 85% of India, but yet the central argument is that Hindus are victimized. Hindus have been injured, and that we need to reclaim our place in society, right? And so that in order to get there, that violence is something that is happening in both countries, and the politicians are not strongly criticizing it. The law and order situation, I would argue yesterday what happened here was such a different scenario than we saw in Black Lives Matter, right? Of how law and order responded to these situations. And we see similar things happening in India. You see people lynched, people killed in broad daylight, but yet the response is not as strong as it ought to be because it keeps continuing. Because there isn't a condemnation of the kind that shuts it down. People are not arrested for what they did. They're not being prosecuted for what they did. So there seems to be a complicity in the government with what's going on. And so that kind of masculine violence is very much, I think, at the heart of the public imagination of Hindu nationalism.
Yeah, I was really struck by the one quote that you put at the beginning or at the header of one of the sections from a politician who said, referencing the nuclear tests, that it had to be done to show the world that we weren't eunuchs.
Exactly.
And that kind of explicit linkage between sort of violence and masculinity was astounding, and I think kind of oddly rare.
And I remember during another time, Indira Gandhi, when she was prime minister and was quite dictatorial at different times then, and someone who said the rest of the parliament, it's not only that they're not women, they are widows, right? So again, this thing of the levels of that, of widowhood, not having a woman without a man, right? So we see these kinds of phrases coming up all the time.
So I want to continue down the road of exploring the gender dimensions of this, but I want to turn our attention a little bit to the question of environmental politics in India. And you have this phrase in the book that all post-colonial environmental politics is a form of gender politics. Can you flesh this out for us a little bit and talk about how gender informs the intersections between nation and nature in India?
So part of what I'm doing in that chapter is talking about a politics of rescue, is what I see as happening. And so we have Mother India and we have Mother Earth. And so in sort of tracking both those ideas of a Hindu nationalism and the idea of preserving Mother Earth. And so there are several things I'm doing in that chapter, but one of them is looking, for example, one of the projects I work on outside of this is work on invasive species. And part I'm interested in how, and this is not just India, this happens in the US as well, is about how we claim that certain species are natives, certain species are alien, right? And so then we draw borders around nations in claiming this nativeness. And then it becomes about protecting the nation by killing alien species and protecting native species. In a country like the US, it's particularly ironic of who the natives are, right? The natives are the white settlers, not the original natives of this continent. So again, of how native is a category that gets manufactured. And similarly in India, before 1947, there was no India. It was a South Asian continent. And so part of the project of the Indian nation has been about creating that nation and creating the borders of that nation. So one of the cases I track in the chapter is about the Setu Samudram Bridge project, which was a bridge that was imagined between India and Sri Lanka. So that currently now ocean liners that have to go all the way around Sri Lanka to come to the eastern coast of India from the west. And the idea was to dredge a canal between India and Sri Lanka so then the ships could go through that. And two groups very vociferously protested this. One were environmentalists who said we were losing a lot of indigenous native species in that are unique to that region. And again, so what I do is sort of track the ways in which environmentalists talk about nativeness and the protection of the environment. And again, always, the nature is seen as passive, is seen as victim, is seen as without agency. And then we also have religious nationalists who say that there are these shoals. You see a structure in the bottom of the ocean, and they claimed this was the bridge that. So for those who don't know the Ramayana, so part of what happens in the Ramayana, so Rama is a god who is sent into exile, and he and his wife is Sita. And there is a demon god called Ravana, who's supposedly in Lanka, who kidnaps Sita. And so Sita is in Lanka. And so Rama gets Hanuman, who is a monkey god. And so he and his team of monkey gods build a bridge between India and Sri Lanka. And so the Hindu nationalists claim this is that bridge, the Hanuman's bridge that is in the bottom. And so they said on religious grounds we should not dredge it because this is a religious site. And so there was a real debate that emerged of whether they should allow the dredging of this canal. And Nivedita Menon has a wonderful analysis where she's sort of tracking these debates across both. And part of the argument is that ultimately environmentalists take on the arguments of the Hindu nationalists, and Hindu nationalists take on the arguments of the environmentalists. So you begin to see a real synergy between the two sides. And this is a part of India that I grew up with it, but it's so in evidence. So after the book, I was in India a couple summers after that, and I was talking to my cousin and his wife. And so one of the stories about Hanuman is that there was a point when Rama's brother falls ill. And so he needs a particular herb that could only be found in this particular mountain. And so Hanuman goes and carries the mountain. And Hanuman couldn't tell exactly which herb it was. So he decided he would just bring the mountain. And the story is that one part of the mountain falls down onto earth. And it's near where I was born. And my cousin's wife is in a different town, and they have a different claim that it is that mountain. And so these are both, have master's degrees. We had a half an hour argument of who was right. Which was the mountain that fell off, the mountain that Hanuman carried. And so these are sort of very common about the ways in which these mythological stories are so wound into the everyday. It's not that people believe monkeys fly, but there's a way in these mythologies are so ingrained within the cultural life of India that it's not surprising that this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, which had to adjudicate seriously whether this could be a bridge, in this mythological story built, by a monkey god who could fly. And so it's so part of what I'm talking about, this politics of rescue of Mother India and Mother Earth, where both get feminized, right? They both become these feminine objects that environmentalism has to protect, environmentalism has to save. And so it's that politics of rescue that I track through that as being at the heart of post-colonial environmentalism.
Yeah, another element in all of this, obviously, is caste. And theoretically, Foucault, I think, is especially helpful in thinking about caste as a system of social organization. But, I was really struck by the fact that you home in on the ecological dimensions of caste in a way that was just fascinating. Can you talk about how caste has been valorized by Hindu nationalists as a positive mode of ecological sustainability, even as its violent and oppressive qualities are erased in the nationalist discourse?
So one of the things I discuss in that piece are these theories of what are called ecological partitioning or niche partitioning. So one of the arguments in ecology is that one way in which different organisms can, where we can maintain biodiversity in a particular ecological space, or is if each species specializes in a different niche, right? So that finally each species gets what it needs in order to survive, but they're not trying to outcompete each other. So this is one mode of how diversity in an ecological landscape can be maintained. And so one of the ecological theories that was proposed was caste is a way of resource partitioning, right? So that each group specializes in a different, one group, are cattle farmers, another group, they gather this particular kind of crop, another group does something. So it was a model looking at different regions in India and making the argument that caste was an adaptive innovation within the South Asian context that allowed for multiple groups to survive. And of course, part of the problem here is that, the power structures across these different groups are so enormously different. And about recasting caste as this benign innovation of ecological resource partitioning as a way to survive. Similarly, people valorize ideas of sacred groves. So there are spaces in India all around a forest that have been deemed to be sacred groves because often they have temples or religious significance, attached to it, and so you cannot disrupt sort of those spaces. But yet, people will show you that lower castes are not allowed into those sacred spaces. Women sometimes are not allowed into those sacred spaces. So whenever we use these bounds of the sacred, they always come with exclusions of different kinds. They always come with assumptions about, whose rights are supported, right? Who is included and who is excluded. And so in these claims of, Hinduism is such a ecologically progressive religion because we have these sacred space, and caste was invented because of that, but then it's been perverted soon, are these very profound assumptions of who is telling the story, of who is included in it and who is excluded in it.
Yeah, and the question of caste is also explored in the book by looking at the discussion of genetics and the political struggles around DNA and DNA analysis and its implications. And can you talk about how scientific studies in India have linked caste and the question of race, and how Dalit activists have responded, and more broadly, sort of what this shows us about the fraught politics of identity in India?
Yes, and this is a fraught politics of genomics worldwide, where, as I was saying earlier on, so Richard Lewontin has this wonderful phrase of what's it? Old bottles, new wine, right? That we keep, it's the same old container, the same old politics of racial difference, sex difference, caste difference, and then we just keep pouring new things and as though it's something new, but the structure is the same, about making claims that this group is different than that group. And these claims of biological determinism are really important, because once you say that, so for example, there was a time when it was believed that women were not capable of rationality, that they could not be rational creatures and therefore should not be allowed into higher education. So when it is grounded in biology, you make an immutable claim, right? You're claiming that you can throw all the Title IX programs for women to help women in science or women in higher education, but if they're biologically incapable, it is a futile attempt. And so that is why biology is so important, because its claims ground whether political or public interventions are useful at all. And so these questions of race and caste have, since British times. So there's a very long history of it. And it's a very interesting history. So in part, what the British tried to do was to impose race and caste on, on India. And at least when I was growing up in the south of India, sort of the argument is that the fairer skinned people had Aryan blood in them, and the darker that you were more Dravidian or indigenous, right? So there were very facile ways in which it got superimposed on each other purely by the color of the skin. And Hindu nationalists really challenged this idea of Aryan migration or Aryan invasion. So now I think no one talks about an invasion anymore. It's an Aryan migration theory. So Hindu nationalists argue that Indians are all indigenous to India. There was no outside migration into India. And so they challenged the whole idea of an Aryan migration theory. And this, again, is a long, enduring debate. At one time, people looked at language and the fact that Sanskrit and English have common roots in terms of language, of looking at caves within India, of when the horse first emerges. And so there were sort of philological, archaeological, historical evidence that there were series of Aryan migrations, and that is part of the example of the peopling of India. And recently with genomics, there was a study by Michael Busch and a whole number of co-authors that claimed that upper caste Hindus were more European than lower caste Indians, right? So then this again came back to that old thing as race is caste. And so in I think this was 2 conferences ago, the World Conference Against Racism, Dalit groups in India took that evidence to saying, see, race is caste. And so the international community should be monitoring India for casteism as racism. And so there's a part of what I track are the debates sort of surrounding that. But at the heart of it is both are making biologically determinist arguments of, when race is caste. And some people who feel that neither is true, that both race and caste are constructs of different kinds, that we shouldn't ground it in the body and make these kind of biological claims. Others who make, other kinds of arguments. And post-conference, this evidence continues because these kinds of comparative genomics are at the heart of all ancestry projects. There is this the HapMap projects that are, for example, trying to track health, the preponderance of hypertension or diabetes or different kinds of health conditions in different parts of the world, and using genomics as a way to say, is this group, does this group have a higher propensity for X, Y, or Z? Now, for me, the problem of these comparisons is how poor the data is. So part of what you do in these comparisons is you have a certain data set, and so this data set that they took was in a certain state in India called Andhra Pradesh, and it was looking at certain castes within Andhra Pradesh, and then they compare it with these groups, and sometimes it might be a small tribal group in one part of the region. Sometimes you will have Eastern Europe, whatever that means. Sometimes you'd have continents as a group, sometimes nations as a group, sometimes tribes, small tribal populations as a group. And these are all, and so these comparative work make claims on what seem like very incommensurate data points or data groups. And so I think there are a lot of problems, and many people have written about the problems with these kinds of genomic conclusions. But as I was saying, these politics of difference seem to move from body part to body part, and the latest form is, sort of came around genomics. But what is interesting about Dalit groups is this claim of race and caste, again, goes back a long way in that they are claiming a Black brotherhood across the world, right? So it's about trying to create a transnational politics of Blackness, and the ways in which anti-Blackness pervades many nations of the world, and that there needs to be solidarity and transnational unity across that. So, that's a very progressive and important politics. And so there are very competing politics playing out with genomics and with these different kinds of claims. And I doubt this will end, much like the politics of race. We will have new genetic technologies or other kinds of technologies, and we will churn new data to, to get at this question, which is ultimately a political question. Mm-hmm. And I think that's at the heart of what I'm trying to argue in that chapter.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
One other point I wanted to make is, so the heart of the argument of the book is that, yes, there was undoubtedly a great civilization in the South Asian region beyond, right? And if you look at mathematics, science, philosophy, there was a very robust civilization that produced very important knowledge that has been taken up by, Western knowledge systems as well. And I am very sympathetic to questions of that knowledge has been colonized, right? And that we need to question Western knowledge systems that, even though I grew up in post-independent India, I pretty much, got a British-style education, right? If you think of how botany was taught to me or sociology was taught to me, nearly all the theorists that you study are Western theorists. And so I'm very sympathetic to the question of an anti-colonial science, that we need to decolonize knowledge and think of other ways to do it. And this is part of what post-colonial studies has been studying, for quite some time, making the point that the people in power in post-colonial nations have very much continued a Eurocentric tradition of, the knowledge systems that, they have situated. And so there's a way in which the politics of Hindu nationalism, at least on the surface, of making claims of anti-colonial science is, I am very drawn to that. But where they go with it is, to me, a very facile place of mythology, right? Of saying, oh, these things must have existed. Yes, this was a grand civilization. So take a case like Ayurveda, which is a very ancient medical system, and it has a very different model of the body than Western medicine. But what has happened with Ayurveda, for example, recently, all the money that has gone in is in developing projects like Ayur genomics, right? And what they're positing here is not a system, an epistemology of Ayurveda that competes with Western science. Money has gone into saying how it can work hand in hand with Western science. how there can be a synergy between, rather than developing a competing epistemology of the body, that the body works very differently. Western medicine is a reductionist way in which it solves medical problems. And so to me, that's the part that I find very disappointing. But yet, at the heart of that the idea of an anti-colonial science, of developing alternate models of the body, of the environment, of the world, I think is very, very important as someone who works in feminist science and technology studies. And so again, where genomics goes is a very conservative place, hand in hand with Western genomics, with all the problematic assumptions of race and gender and class and caste, rather than refashioning an alternate vision of what science might look like.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I'm struck by throughout the book, is the degree to which the technology doesn't really force the politics to reconsider itself, but the politics seems to organize around the technology to sort of further its own ends.
Exactly.
So I wanted to turn our attention, we're running a little bit short on time, so I wanted to talk about the politics of procreation. And you note that the womb is an important site of politics, and I want to reflect on the ways in which caste and gender figure directly into that politics. And at the book's end, you focus on the question of surrogacy particularly. Can you talk about how Indian bionationalism transforms different women in the political imaginary, and the ways in which this sheds light on how Hindutva fuses the sciences and religion into this archaic modernity?
Yeah. So part of what I'm doing in the book is to track the womb in post-colonial India, starting with sort of early on, where India becomes the site of population explosion for across the world, and really becomes a laboratory for contraception, sterilization abuse, and sort of studies of demography. I mean, a lot of people have written about this, that India really becomes the laboratory of the world for making those kinds of Malthusian claims or neo-Malthusian claims. The idea that there are too many people. The problem is that there are too many people in the world, rather than resources are not being distributed to everyone in the world, right? And these are fundamentally very different political imaginaries of who you blame. If you believe in overpopulation, then you blame, and what has happened across the world is you blame the women. You blame people who have wombs and will produce children. If you believe it is a problem of resources, then you are thinking economically and politically of how we might have a different system. So that people are having children not because they don't have access to contraception, they are having children because it's a political necessity. Either because the children help in the farm work, the children bring in income to the family that's important, or that you need, there is no social security, so in your old age, you're counting on your children to take care of you. And in countries with very high infant mortality, you have to have many children, that you might have one or two that survive. And indeed, all the evidence has suggested that when infant mortality has gone down, family planning has shifted, right? But yet the logic of this neo-Malthusian population problem is long enduring. And even in India now, even with the current administration, we see talks of that. And that fundamentally sees women as victims and whose fertility needs to be controlled, either through incentives, or we have had periods where, of sort of very of enforced sterilizations of various kinds. And so there was this early part of India where it was seen as the site of overpopulation, and so the problem was really about fertility, and the fertility of predominantly women or people with wombs needed to be contained. And then we see a transformation about 10, 20 years ago, when surrogacy as a technology becomes possible. And there is suddenly India becomes this site of the cradle of civilization, of women as entrepreneurs. And again, it's like it is largely poor women, women who need money, often lower caste women. And it's really interesting to me in those narratives about the ways in which caste plays out, that in some places it somehow doesn't seem to matter, right, of who the surrogate is, and the ways in which biology gets written into, both from the point of view of the surrogate women and the commissioning parents, of what exactly is happening there, of what kind of exchanges are taking place, what exactly is gestation. And there's a lot of wonderful ethnographic literature looking at surrogacy, but in many cases, women left the home and they were, housed in hostels of various kinds. And again, here the narratives that the surrogate mothers develop is also very interesting. And again, there's a good literature on that. And so so part of what was really interesting to me at this point is, and I think there is a real tension within the ruling party on whether this kind of entrepreneurial possibilities was something that needed to be fostered, or whether this was fundamentally an exploitation of women. And even within the feminist community, there is a real debate on, should this be outlawed because it's exploitative, or do we need to regulate it? And I think most feminists, or many feminists, have gone the mode that what needs to happen is regulation. Surrogate mothers need greater control. They need to know what exactly they're doing, because often they sign things in a language they do not understand. They need to have protections, sort of healthcare protection. So what happens if there's a miscarriage? Somewhere, are they paid? Are they not paid? What happens if they've given birth and then there are problems after? Are they protected? And so I think feminists have really been working that there are economic reasons why people are doing this. And so we need to find ways of giving them real power to make decisions that aren't exploitative. But I think what ended up happening, though, is that the government banned gestational surrogacy. I think people can do altruistic surrogacy, but money cannot exchange hands. And India is not alone in this. Other countries do too. But part of what I chronicle in the book is the reasons why the government gives. And they're very paternalistic reasons, right? We need to protect women can't be exploited. And the worry in India, as in other countries, is just whether this will go underground, where women will actually have even less protections and absolutely no regulations. The other thing that has to be said about reproduction is just the and this is again not new, is this idea that minority women have too many babies. And that that this is a problem. And again, this is a rhetoric that is, not only in India, you see that in the US as well, and especially with respect to Muslim women's fertility. And that has again been a very important narrative throughout.
Fantastic. We're running a little bit short on time. I wanted to just punch in a quick question from the audience. And I'm not sure if you're equipped to answer it directly, but I think it touches back on something you mentioned before about sort of the decolonizing of knowledge. And that is what your views are on Paulo Freire's theories of the pedagogy of the oppressed. And I think maybe if that's too particular, can you just reflect quickly on sort of how you understand the project of decolonizing knowledge, and specifically through modes of education?
So, I think Freire's work is very, very important, and I think has certainly, with respect to women, gender, sexuality studies, has certainly shaped how we think about the classroom, of who we assign, who we read in the classroom, of how we shape classroom dynamics. So I think Freire is very, very influential in my field, certainly. So my new work is actually on decolonizing botany. So and I think decolonization is obviously a very, very big project and big question, so in part, sort of how I'm approaching it is, is about part of what we need a better account of is how colonialism shaped science. And that is part of Holy Science is also about that quest, is that, yes, we can say we will do away with race, we will do away with caste, all of which are worthy goals. But even if we did away with them, we do not do away with racism and casteism, because they are embedded structurally in science, in sociology, in academic knowledge, in public policy, in medicine, everywhere. So we need better accounts of how colonialism, race, slavery, how these histories are in every pore of the fabric, of the country. And so part of, my work so far has been trying to figure that out, right? And lots of people have written about it. And so I think we need better accounts of that, and I think we need more accounts of that before we can move to alternate imaginations in talking about decolonization. But I think decolonization has to be a process. There is no magic alternative we'd produce, just because it's taken centuries for us to get here. And it will take some time for us to get out of it with these alternate imaginations.
Yeah. Finally, I was wondering if you'd be willing to reflect on COVID and the extent to which we've seen bionationalism at work in India during the pandemic and what that looks like.
Yes, I think COVID has further strengthened Hindu nationalism. I think the government has used it very strategically to embolden itself, to crack down on dissent of various kinds, to technologically consolidate Hindu nationalism. So, in short, so I've written some in the last few months, just in tracking what's happening in India. So there's a piece in Somatosphere with Debjani Bhattacharya, where we are looking at the contrast of, on the one hand, Prime Minister Modi doing these very short talks saying we will have a lockdown at such and such period. But then the WhatsApp interprets those in using Vedic sciences. Or actually, he did this at this time because we are asked to bang plates at this time, light candles at this time, because of that. So it's really interesting of how Hindu nationalism, sort of has used these moments to consolidate it using social media. It's really interesting that, part of this decisiveness was, I think, and a lot of people have written about it, about overnight, that within 4 hours there was a lockdown that was proposed that really did not take into account migrant workers who were caught in cities all over the country. And so ultimately, much of those actions really seem to best serve middle-class gated communities who could stay safe in there, but people who needed to work every day, were left with not enough resources. And again, it's interesting when we were talking earlier about the mode of science, right? So at some level, I would argue that India doubled down on the Western model of lockdown, versus there were other epidemiologists in India who said we need a different model, that the economy and health cannot be seen as binary opposites here. There are people who, need that everyday money. And so we need a different model. And people have proposed other kinds of models that India could have taken on, but did not. But rather, did this Western model of a 3-week lockdown, but then that time was not used to prepare the country. So when the lockdown ended, we saw a resurgence of those numbers.
Yeah. So we're just about out of time. Banu, I wanted to thank you again for joining us today on the Polis Project Digital Book Salon. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in. Again, our guest this morning was Dr. Banu Subramaniam, who is the author of Holy Science, The Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, which is the book that we discussed today, published by the University of Washington Press. For those of you that are interested in purchasing the book, the press has kindly extended Polis viewers a 30% discount. The discount code can be found on our website. Thank you again. We will look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks' time. Until then, take care, be safe, and we'll look forward to further conversations with you all in the future. Goodbye.